Industrial profits in China have fallen to maybe their worst on record for 2024, when what was supposed to have been a turnaround success story, especially where it came to government stimulus programs. But that's just where it begins. China's banking crisis and real estate crisis has flared up once again, with one of its major developers threatening to run out of money. And against all of that, we have markets across the entire global complex that are suggesting these big problems in China are already spilling over outside of its borders. Iron prices way down. The Baltic Dry, the index for shipping dry goods and raw materials around the planet, that one has plunged. Even though it's normally weak in this part of the year for winter, it is more weak this year than certainly last year, the Baltic Dry being less than half of its rate from December of 2023. And against that backdrop, Chinese President Xi Jinping says the country there is in for what he said, quote, was a very arduous reform, which means that there's more pain ahead. Though he did pat himself and the rest of the government on the back by saying that everything in 2024 went smoothly, at least according to the CCP. So next year is supposed to be really bad. Though you shouldn't worry because the Chinese government is on the case. Well, that's what markets and results in the economy are saying. Well, they may be on the case, but it's not working out all that well. So, Mr. Van Meter, Steve, China, where do we want to start here? Because the macroeconomy is, I mean, it's been the same, that it's been even weaker, but basically the same shape it's been all along, despite stimulus. I mean, but here we have the banking system real estate problem that was supposed to have been the major focus of the government, not just in September, but also go back to May when they had that historic housing rescue. Here we have one of the biggest Chinese developer that so far has been able to avoid default, now saying very quietly, just rumors leaking out, that we need to make sure that we have enough liquidity that we can survive without defaulting over the next little while. So where do you pick your poison here? Do you want to start with the government, the macroeconomy, or the banking system, real estate?
Jeff, let's talk about stimulus, because you want to talk about an absolute failure of policy. China is just a perfect example. And I think this is interesting because a lot of people now think, okay, well, if the U.S. economy slows down, it's no problem. Stimulus will come and it will work. But let's look at what China did. They said we need to inject the banks with capital to make them lend, and not because they're going insolvent or there's liquidity issues, because we just need them to have some more capital to lend. And well, what do we find out? The banks are largely illiquid. They went to the real estate developers and said, look, we're going to give you a bunch of cheap loans from the banks, and that's going to help out. Well, as you just mentioned, that didn't really do anything either. And then they went to the consumer, who they really said was the problem, and they gave them just a little bit, said, hey, you know what? We're going to give you some money to upgrade your home appliances and your cars. And then what happened? That actually worked, but just briefly, at the sacrifice of other demand plunging. So you look at what happened in China, and they had this, the desperate need for some sort of stimulus. And Jeff, it didn't do anything. In fact, maybe it kicked the can down maybe a couple months.
Yeah, I think it's even worse than that, Steve, because, when you get into major government interference, it really is interference. It's basically a distortion. As you said, they wanted to stimulate consumer spending, get retail sales up, because retail sales have been the laggard there for the entire decade of the 2020s so far. Consumers refuse to spend, and it's pretty obvious why they won't, because most of their wealth is tied up in the real estate sector. And if you are absolutely no faith in housing prices staying up, and you're worried that housing prices are going to get worse, there might be fire sales and liquidations, the last thing you're going to do is go out and just splurge on everything. So the Chinese government comes along and says, let's give consumers all of these goodies and handouts to get them spending. And they did. They went, and, like you said, Steve, they went and they spent on those things the government said that we want you to spend on, but they didn't spend more overall. They just redistributed their spending from one pocket to the other, which means that the Chinese government essentially transferred the spending problem from one place and made it worse in another place, which is, but that's the effect of stimulus, and not just in terms of this this consumer program. It's that government stimulus at its best maybe creates a short run impact, but even then it's a distortion and it's an artificial imposition that ends up making a situation more harm than good.
But see, this comes right back to industrial profits. We talk about the Chinese consumer, but what's going on in China is no different than the European consumer, the American consumer. Everybody is spending less. But why is that? It's about the labor market. They're going to work, and what are they finding out? That the fax machine, as we talk about new orders, they're not coming in as much. And they're getting a sign, hey, there's some backlogs, you can work on that. But when they're doing that, they're noticing the pile of backlogs is going down, not up. And the new orders aren't actually enough to sustain the workforce. So what Chinese consumers are feeling, which is what we're seeing all around the world, is a lack of demand. And so it makes perfect sense. Yes, there's an aspect, of course, of the real estate market and concern about that. But if you're going to work and you're worried that, hey, maybe my hours are going to get cut, or maybe I'm going to lose my job. And if I do, well, my friends have lost their job. They haven't found another one. The natural thing you're going to do is cut your spending. And it makes perfect sense. And all of a sudden, that's just backfeeding into industrial profits, which is just a response by the fact that retail sales aren't growing.
Yeah, I think that's really China is not just a victim of its own internal issues, right? Because that's part of it. China has its own real estate problem, which is itself born from the fact that there has been no global demand over the last 15 years. That's where China built this real estate bubble, trying to do something about the fact that global external demand just disappeared after 2008. It never came back. They were all expecting it to come back, and it just never did. So now they have this real estate bubble, but none of the growth that was supposed to have been there. But really, there's the internal problem in China that's a big issue for the Chinese, certainly. But there's also this external problem that has apparently gotten really a lot worse because, as you mentioned, Steve, industrial profits, that's almost entirely a reflection of China's ability to make stuff and sell it elsewhere. And with industrial profits falling as sharply as they have, and I'll go over the numbers in just a second here, with industrial profits falling as sharply as they have, what that says is that the Chinese they very much want to sell anything they possibly can to the United States, to Japan and South Korea and Africa and Europe and everywhere else around the world, but they're encountering resistance. And I don't mean trade wars, I don't mean tariffs, they're encountering a lack of demand. And so now they have to cut their prices, which are already low to begin with. That's the reason why they're able to dump all these products on the rest of the world. So they have to cut their low prices by a lot, which eats into profits. And so the worse industrial profits in China become, the worse it is in terms of global demand, because when they have to cut profits this much, it means they're discounting left and right. They're really running the fax machine backwards, trying to get prices to go even lower, just to trying to spark some demand.
Yeah, Jeff. And when you see companies profits decline, what happens next? Well, of course, we know they're going to cut expenses every which way, but there's a point where they can't cut those anymore. So what happens? It turns to labor. Hey, we don't need you as much. We're going to cut some hours here. We're going to cut some jobs. And we know those jobs don't come back. And so what we're seeing in China is just a reflection of, like you said, what's going on all around the world. They're trying to dump their goods on every major economy, but nobody really wants it, because when we look at the manufacturing sector, whether it's in Japan or Europe, the US, or anywhere in the world, what do we see? The same thing that's happening in China. A lack of demand, production is slowing down, profits are declining, and yet nobody has the answer other than what we're seeing is consumers all around the world are tapped out.
Yeah, the idea of keeping up production and dumping the goods, as you point, that's the whole point of that, is so that China doesn't have to experience labor market weakness. They're selling their stuff on the rest of the world so that they can keep factories running. Otherwise, they're going to have to do what Steve said, which is they're going to have to cut back on hours, if maybe even cut back on workers. They've already stopped hiring. There have been rumors of some labor market unrest in China. Of course, there's always rumors, but it's certainly in keeping with where China's economy is going and the fact that the vast industrial sector is experiencing this much trouble. So let me just briefly go over the numbers here. The industrial profits, these are an accumulated year-over-year basis for the year-to-date period, January through November 2024, and they were down 4.7% compared to the same 11 months in 2023, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. But you have to remember, industrial profits were turning around. They were rising in the first half of this year as it looked like global demand was picking up. China's internal situation may have stabilized compared to where it was at the end of last year because of last year's stimulus, but it didn't last that long. And by the time we got to summertime, something big changed in terms of industrial profits. And what you saw was back in August, profits fell by 16.7% just in that month, year over year in August alone, which was an enormous decline, followed by September's minus 27%, which was one of the biggest on record. And then still further decline in October, 10%, and then another 7.3% decline in November. So you've got 4 straight months of massive declines that also coincide with the same 4 straight months as Steve pointed out. We're seeing weakness around the rest of the global economy. So it all fits together. China's massive problems are as much about what's going on inside as well as outside.
You know, Jeff, and that's really interesting as you look at the data showing further contraction in profits, because you think about the timing of this, and we wouldn't expect that. You would normally think, hey, we're heading the holiday season. You know, we would see the factories start to turn up, profits would grow, but we didn't see that at all. In fact, there's been all this talk of front-running tariffs. So once again, you would think, all right, the factories are going to ramp up. There's going to be a bunch of production. Profits are going to go up, and they're going to get everything out of there. And we know, of course, in the beginning of the year, things are going to change, even naturally. We know particularly U.S. consumers go from spending to paying down debt. We know demand's likely to fall anyways, but you wouldn't expect it this time of the year.
Yeah, and so it's why, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much problems in the banking sector as well, because the banking sector in China depended upon largely industrial success, so lending to industry to generate profits for the banking system that they would then use to offset their losses and growing losses in the developer sector. And I do want to mention that too. I said that in the beginning of this video here, that we're seeing some really alarming signs from the banks as well as the developers. And here's the latest. A major Hong Kong builder is asking lenders to extend loans. Another industry peer is selling an iconic but largely empty mall in Beijing. So latest signs of stress are adding to concerns that the worst is far from over for the housing sector in the world's #2 economy, which was once a powerful growth engine, is now a big drag on demand for items from furniture to cars, and furniture from cars, not just inside China. And they are particularly worrying because this is in terms of China Vanke's. Their woes are showing that the liquidity crisis is hurting one of the few big builders that have avoided default thus far. The trouble faced by its Hong Kong peers, Vanke's Hong Kong peers, meanwhile, means that the contagion is increasingly being felt offshore. Again, demonstrating that this is not just a China problem, but as China's real estate woes flare up, and largely because of this intertwined relationship between the real estate sector, the banking sector, and the real economy. Now, you can't get one of them going to fix the others, because they're all just failing together. You have this contagion that's not just about China. It actually extends offshore to Hong Kong, which is another reason why the currency is as weak as it is. And so the reason why it's contributing to risk aversion behavior around the rest of the world, because there's a lot of exposure to what's happening in China, not just inside, but also outside too.
Yeah, Jeff, and I like the fact you brought up the banks here, because a lot of people don't understand the relationship of how they get involved. And you think about it, it makes perfect sense. So a developer wants to build a tower, and sell homes. So they go to the bank and they borrow money, start building it, and eventually sell off the property. Same in the manufacturing sector. The fax machine whirs, you get an order, you say, great, I don't have the money to fulfill it. I'm going to go to the bank and borrow it. So how is the bank going to get paid back? Well, it's simple. When the homes get sold, or when the goods get sold. But the problem is, coming out of the pandemic, we went from a supply and demand switch where there was more demand than was supply. And now there's far more supply than demand. And based on what China's doing of trying to save their economy by, hey, let's just overproduce and dump it on everyone's door, is not going to help at all. What we're going to find out is we're going to see these massive amounts of inventories all over the world. They're going to need to be, of course, brought down. That means there's going to be disinflation, perhaps even deflation in certain parts of the economy. And banks are going to be holding these loans, wondering if they're going to get paid. The question would be, can they sustain long enough? And the answer is no, they can't.
Yeah, 4 straight months of really bad industrial profits, not just a risk for the China's labor market or those industrial firms. Like you said, I mean, it's a banking matter most of all, because the banks are like, you got to believe there's a lot of bankers in Shanghai sitting there sweating bullets because they're thinking, oh boy, this is not going so well. And you got to believe that the Chinese industrial firms, they're not willingly cutting prices and cutting into their profits like this. They have to. When you see a 27% monthly decline in industrial profits, one of the worst on record, That is being forced on these businesses because they don't have any other choice. On the one side, they've got the government saying, "Get going here. We want this stuff to move. We want to keep the factories humming." And on the other side, you get the bankers saying, "Hey, what are you doing over there? We need to get paid back. We can't afford you to default on the loan, or even just to change the terms of the loan." So it's coming from all sides, including outside of China, because this is really about, in terms of industrial profits, about the inability to sell this stuff in the way they thought. So, Steve, let me ask you this one final question. What do you think? What were the Chinese thinking? Because they thought, middle of the year, the U.S. economy, the European economy is picking up, so let's dump all our products. And then they come back and say, "Holy crap, that didn't work. We tried to dump our product, but there was no demand." So what do you think the Chinese are thinking about all of that?
Jeff, I think they're in complete panic mode, and you see it with the banks, because what have they come out and recently said? Hey, we're gonna give the banks some more money, but it's just because we want them to lend. It's not because anything else is going wrong here. But no, the reality is the bankers, like you said, they're sweating bullets. They're going to, of course, the politicians who have forced them to lend, and they're saying, "Look, we're not sure that these loans are even going to hold because, well, nothing's selling." Government comes along and says, "All right, well, we'll give you some money, but obviously we're going to cover it up as just you're going to lend more." And of course, the bankers, we know they don't want to lend. So what is this telling us, Jeff? We know everybody's panicking there, because what is the bond market in China telling us? 10-year yields collapsing, which is really fascinating, because you're now seeing in the news, Chinese bond yields are crashing because of stimulus. Well, you look to the US and what do you see? The exact opposite. Long bond is going up because the Fed's cutting rates. It's like, no, what's going to happen in the U.S. is the same thing what's happening in China. The bond market is telling us exactly the problems there. They're going to get worse. Right now, we see, of course, in the U.S., a lot of money managers want to be short the long bond, want to dump the long bond. What we know eventually, what's happening with rates in China is going to happen here, because the bond market is ultimately telling us exactly what's happening all around the world. And that is, none of these policies are working.
Yeah, the Chinese bond market and the yields there are shockingly synchronized with the rest of the world. And the reason is because China is such an important part to it. And yeah, I think I have to agree with you, Steve. I think that Bazooka in September was a lot in response to not just developments in the financial markets or the real estate sector, but banks saying, "We've called up all of our industrial contacts and they can't sell their goods. So what do we do now?" And I think Beijing, like you said, Steve, Beijing was just like, "Oh crap, what do we do now?" And so that leads us into this whole thing where China's mess is not really about China. And here we are at the end of 2024, and they're in even worse shape than they were at the end of 2023, which wasn't supposed to be possible. So everything that's happened in between, it's the same exact thing we see with the rising dollar, falling bond yields. It is the downside of the supply shock, and it is, unfortunately, we're still not near the bottom yet.